Hello and welcome to a conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Today we are discussing decolonizing Israel, liberating Palestine, Zionism, settler colonialism, and the case for a one state, one democratic state. And that's the title of a new book by Jeff Halper. He's an American-born anthropologist, author, academic, lecturer, and a political activist. Jeff is well known also from his previous role as the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. Great to have you with us, Jeff, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Jeff, you've had quite an extraordinary intellectual journey. And I was wondering whether you can tell us a bit about it. You were born in the US, then you migrated to Israel because of your Zionist principles. But then you've become, one of the strongest critics of the state of Israel. So share your journey for us quickly.
Well, I didn't really come because of Zionism, in a sense. I grew up in a small town in northern Minnesota, Bob Dylan's hometown, by the way. There was a very tiny Jewish community. So I never really learned much about Judaism. I never became a Zionist in that sense, But I was very involved in the 60s, in the civil rights movement. I was in Mississippi, the anti-war movement. I was a draft resistor and all of that. And part of the 60s that people forget about was identity politics in those days. You had Roots by Alex Haley. So the African-American community began to go back to its roots. You had Cesar Chavez and the Hispanic community going to their roots. You had the Native Americans going back to their roots. Different ethnic groups began, this whole thing of the melting pot in the US began to disintegrate. And I got caught up in that. I didn't really identify with the white American society very much. And my Jewish identity was important to me, but not religiously. I'm not religious at all, but in a sense, Judaism in the sense of an ethnicity. But since it had no expression in the States, really, if I was in New York, I might not have ever gone to Israel because there would have been enough Jewish life there to keep me going. But I'm in Minnesota. See, so what happened was, in a sense, I had an identity shift without an ideology of feeling Jewish, and the Jewish part became more important than the American part, but the only real expression for it would be in Israel, where in a sense, I became an Israeli, before I moved to Israel. It was an identity shift at that time. But I came to Israel, I have to say, as a leftist. I came with my eyes open. I didn't come as a Zionist. I mean, I did feel that Jews have a place in this country. From that point of view, I guess I was kind of a Zionist in a way. But I never really thought that we should have a Jewish state exclusive of Palestinians. So I was very involved in the new left in Israel since the time I came in '73. So that the roots were there. And it's simply over the years, in those days, the two-state solution was the solution. So that was easy to reconcile being an Israeli with the two-state solution because they were separate things. But as the two-state solution began to disappear, I began to see that Israel itself, unless I accept Israel as an apartheid state, which I couldn't do, Israel itself couldn't exist as a Jewish state because it comes at the expense of Palestinian self-determination. So that it simply the logic of the political situation forced me into an anti-Zionist position.
Which is what we'll get to later on.
Right.
But thanks for that.
Just
background.
one more word
Sure.
about the anti-Zionist, and that is I became. This is what I say in the book. How I define myself: a settler who refuses. I accept the fact that I'm a part of a settler colonial enterprise, which is Zionist Israel, but I refuse it, and therefore I'm trying to transcend that and to try to achieve one state together with the Palestinians.
Mhm. I mean, talking about identity then, I mean, do you see a transition like some of the other Jewish people, like, for example, Huey Davis, he defines himself as a Hebrew Palestinian.
That's
or
right.
you have someone like Abraham Berg, who was the former Speaker of the Knesset, who's
That's right.
basically said that he wants to decline his Jewish identity because of apartheid within Israel. So I'm wondering whether you see your transition, your identity transition in that kind of a way.
Sure. I mean, your identity has to be connected to the country you're living in, the political reality you're living in. So when I came here, I came to Israel. I accepted the two-state idea that Arafat accepted later on in 1988. So I had the backing of the PLO in terms of a legitimacy of being a Zionist inside Israel, as long as I agreed to the two-state solution. So that was very comfortable. But once that all collapsed, and I was in a situation where if I keep maintaining that identity, I'm buying into an apartheid regime, because the two-state solution is obviously gone, and it means my people is dominating another people. My identity had not just my political opinion or my views, but my whole identity had to change, because my identity had to go along with what kind of a country. I couldn't reconcile being a Zionist or being Israeli even with the idea that we have to have one democratic state of equal rights with Palestinians. So, your identity, I think, is is an expression of the wider political reality. You can't hang on to an identity if the reality is changing in a drastic
That's
sort
true.
of way.
And that tension you're speaking about is playing out in different ways, and it's really interesting to hear your perspective on that. But turning to your book, I mean, it's not your first book. I mean, you've published many other volumes before that. But you do unpack a lot in your book. I mean, I do highly recommend everyone read the book. How has it been generally received in Israel, in Palestine, and broadly in the West? It touches on a number of themes, number of big topics.
Well, it's a new book, so it hasn't been received widely yet. I think the Palestinians don't have, a real problem with my analysis. On the contrary, my analysis is based on the political program that we developed in the One Democratic State campaign, which is a group I'm involved with, which is led by Palestinians. So the fact that the Palestinians that are involved with us, recommended the book, gave their recommendations in the book, shows that they, we have disagreements here and there, but basically they see my book as reflecting fairly accurately where their thinking is in terms of one democratic state. So I feel comfortable about that. Israelis have no idea about our books. I have to tell you, my books, Ilan Pappé's books of critical Israelis are not translated into Hebrew. And you can't buy them. You can't buy them in the Israeli bookshops. The only place you can get a book by me or by Ilan Pappé or Amir Ahas or others.
Are you saying they're censored? Are you saying they're censored in Israel?
Yeah, well, not censored per se. It's that you have one book company called Steinmatzky's that orders almost all the books from abroad. So there is Zionist bookshop, so they're not going to order my books or Ilan's books or Amir's books or others. So the only place you can get my book is in the educational bookshop, which is a Palestinian bookshop in East Jerusalem. They'll have it, but I mean, Israelis aren't going to go there to buy the book. So in fact, that's really important. The most important thinkers, like Ilan Pappé, for example, especially, but many other critical Israeli thinkers, their works are not published in Hebrew. They're basically only published in English, and therefore Israelis have no exposure, no way to learn about a critical view. We don't, the publishers that would publish our books in Hebrew, I mean, there are some couple left publishers, but we would have to translate the books ourselves and pay for that. And then they would take the book, and it's almost like a vanity press here in a way. And none of us on the left really have the money to go pay for a translation. So it's really interesting how our analysis is out there. We're famous in the world. I think our views have a real impact, but not inside Israel. We're all unknowns.
Which is something we'll get to later on, but it is a major problem. I mean, any political program you suggest has to have the main constituencies behind you, and how you do that is another question altogether. But we'll get to that later on in our program. But going to the main themes of your book, I mean, I found it, as I said, a fascinating read. But for a lot of people, they may find the idea of settler colonialism within Israel as being controversial, and what you're suggesting is a revolutionary. But anyone that's really who knows about the history of Palestine will know that what you're really calling for, in my view anyway, is a restoration and a return of Palestine to what it was before its takeover. So I read your book as a roadmap, much despised word, roadmap, but I read your book as an ideological roadmap to restoring Palestine. And you do an amazing job. So it seems odd that one, so you do an amazing job in that. So can you just lay out some of the, groundwork and the ideas and the key themes of your book, and what you mean by settler colonialism? You despise the word conflict. Why do you despise the word conflict and defining Israel-Palestine as a conflict? Why do you want us, or people, your readers, to accept your framing of it as a settler colonial enterprise?
Well, that's the point. It's a reframing. It isn't simply a semantic difference. There's, in other words, how you frame, how you analyze a situation determines what kind of a conclusion you can come to. So that our problem is, all these years, it's been misanalyzed as a conflict. Because a conflict, has to do with two or more sides. And they fight about something. And the way to resolve a conflict then is conflict resolution. You get the sides together, they negotiate, they compromise, and they come to some kind of a technical peace, and that resolves it. Settler colonialism is a whole different thing. Now, settler colonialism is not a new analysis. I didn't invent that. It's really been in the academic literature for quite a while, at least for the last decade. There's a whole journal of settler colonialism. There's hundreds of articles about settler colonialism, even in Palestine. The problem is that it's been confined to the academic world. I mean, the whole term settler colonialism sounds very academic. You've got to explain it to people. And then, of course, the only way to resolve a colonial situation is through decolonization. Well, people say, what in the hell is that? So the problem is, the language of conflict is easier for people to grasp. We know what a conflict is. We know what occupation is. We know what apartheid is. So those terms are easy to get across, but they're not the right terms, because settler colonialism is unilateral. It's when one people comes to a country, with the intent of taking it over. They're not coming as immigrants. Palestinians have never had trouble with Jews coming to live in this country. As immigrants living here, however they want to live here, living here. Zionism came with the intent, and it was very upfront. They didn't hide it, with the intent of taking over the country, of transforming an Arab country into a Jewish country, of transforming Palestine into the land of Israel. That was the agenda. And there were no sides. It had nothing to do with Palestinians, or Arabs, as we call them. We don't even use the word Palestinians. They weren't a side. We didn't ask them. They have no rights. They had no national existence until today. Israel hasn't recognized the national existence of a Palestinian people or their rights. So that it was unilateral. It's our country. We're entitled to it. And of course, every settler colonial movement makes up a story about why it's entitled to the country rather than the indigenous population. That's true in Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and other places, Algeria and other places. So that's the essential difference. If it was a conflict, like in a war, you can resolve it and compromise and get somewhere. But you can't resolve a settler colonial conflict because the whole thing is unilateral. The idea is we want to take over the country. We don't want to take over, the Zionists don't want to take over 78% of the country or 90% of the country. They want to take over the entire country. And that the term that's used, I think, which is very important, is Judaization. It's not a term we use very often, but that's what captures the dynamic of the Zionist movement for the last 125 years. We're Judaizing the country. We're making it Jewish. And in that process, it goes on until today, there is no compromise. There's no negotiation. There's no other side. And therefore, the only way out is to decolonize, not to try to compromise in some technical sort of way. So the very way you genuinely end this in a just way,
I think we can get to that later on.
Come out of a
Sorry, Jeff.
idea. It comes out of a settler colonial idea.
Let's stick with this settler colonialism for a while longer before we get to the some of your other chapters in the book, chapters 3, where you talk about where you provide the roadmap. I would say the map. So you mention in your book also that I think people generally are aware of settler colonialism is, US, Australia, Canada, and there's different types.
Maybe UK, but not in the US. They have no idea.
Yeah, of course, they will not admit to that. But you do mention that that Zionism is a specific brand of settler colonialism. You distinguish. You say it has distinguishing features, and you describe it as a hybrid regime, which is overseeing triple repression. What do you mean by that? What is so distinctive about the Zionist form of settler colonialism?
Well, because Zionism couldn't take the whole country all at once. It had to take it piece by piece. For example, you had the same thing in the US or in Canada. The American government made treaties with the different American Indian, the Native American groups. They had treaties. They treated them as nations in a way, and they had treaties, but they were all fake, because the minute they discovered gold or oil or they wanted the land, the treaties really meant nothing. Settler colonialism is unilateral again. So you do certain tricks at different times because you can't take everything all at once. And that's what happened here, of course. You took, you bought some of the land, and then you had the 48 war, and you took 78% of the country. The UN gave you 56%, then you conquered another 20-some%, so you end up with 78%. And then in 67, you take the rest of it, and then you make areas A and B in Gaza, because what do you do with the natives, the ethnic Cretes, Bantustans? It's all sort of planned towards one goal of taking over the country. So that you end up with a hybrid regime, because each regime remains even though it's transcended. So you start with settler colonialism, the goal of taking over the whole country. All right, then you move to a two-state solution. So now you've got Israel, which is Israel. And then you move to occupation, because after 19 years, Israel went out and took the rest of the country. So now you've got an occupation. Well, but occupation is a temporary military situation, but Israel, intends for it to be forever. So now it's transforming the occupation into apartheid, because you have a problem here. The majority population is Palestinian, but the country has to be Jewish. So you have to have an apartheid regime. So what you have all wrapped up in one is settler colonialism over the whole country, and then occupation over a portion of the country, and then apartheid again over the whole country. So the problem with the movement, and that's where the conflict problem comes in. because we've seen this as a conflict, all our work has been to end the occupation. I mean, that's one of the major elements of BDS, end the occupation. So we're only taking 22% of the problem, because apartheid and settler colonialism is the entire country. And you're not going to resolve this whole issue by resolving 22% of it.
Yeah, which is, I think, where we're arriving at slowly but surely. I mean, better late than never, I would say. I mean, I'm speaking, of course, of the B'Tselem opinion paper. B'Tselem is the one of the biggest human rights group in Israel, and a month ago it published an opinion piece which basically said exactly what you're saying, that Israel is an apartheid state.
But they really mean over the occupied territory, though.
Sorry?
They're not so much including Israel per se. They're talking more about the occupation again. Settler colonialism really emphasizes that this is the entire country. It's the colonial enterprise, not particular pieces of it.
So I wonder, I mean, some of what you're saying, of course, many, even with the supporters of Israel, will find it quite difficult to hear. But really, if you look at the history of Israel, it shouldn't be that shocking. The founders of Israel, they understood that their project was a settler colonial project, and they described it as such. So I wonder what you think about this whole rebranding of Zionism as a movement for the self-determination of the Jewish people, which is something which we hear a lot about. The Zionism is simply, a Jewish self-determination, but that wasn't how it was portrayed at the beginning by the founding fathers of Zionism. They saw it as a settler colonial entity. So let's speak about that.
That goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning about my Zionism, or how I got here, my identity. Because I believe that Jews have a right of self-determination. I mean, like other peoples do. But self-determination does not necessarily mean a state. You know, self-determination means regaining or controlling the destiny of your people. You have rights over your culture, over your identity, over your land, over resources, control over your own destiny, self-determination. So that's important. For example, the Native Americans want self-determination. The Welsh want self-determination. But that doesn't necessarily mean a state. I mean, the Native Americans aren't fighting for a state of Native Americans. They're fighting for self-determination of their people within a wider American state. So if you have that, so self-determination does not necessarily mean a state. So if you take that concept and move it here, it means that yes, the Jews have their right of self-determination in the sense I mentioned, cultural sovereignty. The Palestinians certainly have their right of self-determination, and they can coexist because you can share a state that's either binational or multicultural, which is the way we're looking at it. And so you can reconcile. The peoples can have their self-determination. They can have access to the land. They can have access to resources. They can have their culture. They can have their religion. They can have their institutions, and nevertheless live within one country. So you can reconcile self-determination of particular peoples with a common political framework. The point is that if you connect self-determination to a state, then it becomes either or. Either then my self-determination has to come in conflict with your self-determination, because there are almost no countries in the world that are populated by only one people. Right. So if every people has a right to exclusive domination and control over a certain territory, you're going to get apartheid all over the world, because you have to have that. So what you have to do is de-link self-determination from political, in other words, de-link cultural sovereignty from political sovereignty.
That's right. I mean, there's lots of nations around the world who don't have a state. That's right. We can cite the Kurds as an example. So many others where nationalism doesn't necessarily mean, or self-determination doesn't necessarily mean a nation state. But moving swiftly forward, because we don't really have a lot of time. I mean, you spend a lot of ground, you cover a lot of ground on chapter 2, looking at the various stages of the Zionist movement. And you introduce a term, which I found quite interesting, dominance management regime. Tell us how that operates within the context of, Zionist colonization.
Well, what I try to show in the book is that there's a structure to settler colonialism. It isn't only that I want to take over the country, but if you compare settler colonial regimes, they have the same process of taking over a country and the same processes of structuring that. How do we keep control? And that's what I call a dominance management regime. Because the problem with settler colonialism is you can never end it. In other words, you can never, the indigenous population, or the population that's being colonized, can never accept that. They can't accept their own oppression, their own colonization as routine, as okay. They can't live with it. So there's always that insecurity. There's always resistance in one way or another. And so a settler colonial regime can only hope to manage a conflict all the time, usually using violence. I mean, settler colonial regimes have to be violent because you've got to put down resistance in all kinds of ways, different kinds of violence. So that means then that they have to control. I have 4 aspects of the dominance. It's an awkward term. It doesn't flow.
Dominance management regime.
But a dominance management regime, has 4 elements. You have to manage the population. You have to manage the land, because the whole point of a settler colonial enterprise is to take over the land. So now you have to have laws and different ways of how you do that. How do you appropriate the land? You have to manage the economy, because it has to be your economy, not and you have to manage legitimacy. How do you sell this? And that's why Israeli Hasbara, PR, is so powerful, because they're constantly thinking about how you always have to be on guard. You always have to be normalizing and protecting and promoting this enterprise that's basically violent and illegitimate and oppressive. So that it's a constant struggle to manage the population you're dominating, to manage the violence, to manage your image, and to keep this going. That's where Netanyahu really is so skilled. How do you keep a violent occupation and massive violations of human rights and international law going in a transparent world like we have, and still keep the support of democracies like the UK and the US and other European countries and the rest of the world? How do you do that? It really means a very sophisticated form of management. So you have to really be aware of managing in all these ways. And I try to show in the book how Zionism over the years has managed and progressed this colonial system.
And I think final chapter, you speak about summoning power, which is quite crucial in the path towards a democratic one-state solution. So how does that work? Summoning power, what do you mean by that? How do Palestinians summon power, or how do anyone who is advocating what you're advocating summon power, and what's the process of doing that?
Well, like I said, there's always resistance. The oppressed people, the colonized people, always has to resist. The question is, resistance to what end? So you have resistance in which you try to keep your own space, you try to keep the colonists off your back, you try to defend yourself. So you have sumud here, which means steadfastness. You've got people that you have intifadas. You have negotiations, which can be seen as a kind of resistance politically. You have different forms of resistance, but the real question is, how do we end settler colonialism? How do we decolonize? How do we free ourselves of that? You see, How do we regain our sovereignty? And for that, you have to summon power, because you're talking about a dominant power over you. You've got to have official, it's not enough just to resist. You have to have a program of your own. And the problem is that we're in a political struggle today without an end game, which is impossible. In other words, the two-state solution has collapsed. We all know that. But there's a vacuum. No one has filled that vacuum. And BDS and all the good things we do, campaigning and lobbying and everything else, are important, but they're not standalone operations. They can't be disconnected from a political program. So summoning power means you've got to have a political program that you're mobilizing around. And that's why we're trying to insert the one democratic state idea as the political program. Then you've got to have a strategy. All right, how are we going to achieve this? That we don't really have yet. We're just developing that. And then you've got to have organization. So you've got to have a plan, a strategy, organization, and then you become an actor. And my problem is, I think in many ways, both the Palestinians, to some degree, and certainly the Israeli left, and maybe the left abroad, we don't see ourselves as political actors like the right wing does. We see ourselves as we resist, we protest, we write, we're very good at critiquing, but we don't jump into the political arena and say, this is our program, and now how are we going to work to get this program forward, you see? And so we have to learn how to summon power, what power is most appropriate for ending a settler colonial kind of a thing. And I think especially adopting and taking a page from the ANC playbook, and that is to mobilize the international civil society. That's the main ally that Palestinians have, not governments, but the people of the world. But the only way you can mobilize people is if you have a political plan to mobilize them around. And that's what we're missing until today. Without a plan, people flounder. People in the UK say, well, we support Palestinian rights, but what am I advocating for? My MP says, well, what do you want? What do I say? End the occupation? I mean, that's, first of all, that's not really what we want. We want more than that. And second of all, it's a slogan. You've got to present a real political plan that's thought out, that's just, that's workable, that you can throw into the political arena and really advocate for. And that's what we're lacking today. So we're calling not only on the Palestinian people, but on all the Palestine support groups around the world, the PSC and church groups and the US campaign and so on, to begin to support our campaign for one democratic state. You can't, I mean, we're starting to argue, you know, first of all, this is Palestinian-led. The Palestinians have to lead this. And if the Palestinians, if we can become a critical voice saying this is the plan we want you to follow, and we can show that we have Palestinian support, then as a Palestine support group, you're obligated, I would say, to support, to adopt this plan. It isn't a choice. You've got, if you really want to support the Palestinians, you have to support them politically. You have to help them summon power. And that means signing on to and promoting the political program that they're beginning to advocate for.
As a principle, Jeff, one democratic state should not be controversial at all. I mean, that's the model of normative model of state around the world, US, UK, so many others. And the Palestinian national movement, right from the beginning, their struggle was one of a liberation from settler colonialism. And their vision was one democratic state. So which is quite sad to see how buy-in to this project has been so difficult. But do you see any green shoots in terms of people accepting and adopting this vision, and then kind of bringing together the global pro-Palestinian activism, which is what you need, you know, civic unity around the world? Do you see that growing in the current geopolitical context?
For sure. I think the people of the world understand. I think governments understand. I think Boris Johnson understands, and Biden, that the two-state solution is gone. They use the two-state solution as a conflict management tool. They don't really believe that the two-state solution is possible. They're just trying to sort of, because they don't want to expend the political capital on one state because they'd get too much flack at home. So this is an easier way to just do conflict management and keep it going forever, you see. But they know that it's gone, the two-state solution. It's obvious. So that's the good thing. But you see, they're not going to expend the political capital. They're not going to start advocating until there's a Palestinian voice. I mean, they say, the PSC, let's say, in the UK, or the British government, let's say, says legitimately, we can't advocate for any solution, one state or two state or any solution, until the Palestinians tell us that that's what they want. You know, we're not Palestinians. You know, we're British, we're Americans, we're French. We can't represent the Palestinians. And unfortunately, the only Palestinian voice you hear today is the Palestinian Authority, this collaborationist regime that, of course, accepts the two-state solution because their whole existence is dependent on support from the international community. So they're collaborators. So only and so in a way, the PSC is stuck, let's say the PSC or the US campaign or other groups, because they know the two-state solution is gone and never existed because it can't exist under a settler colonial idea, but they can't jump to a one state or any other solution until the Palestinians tell them that that's what they want. They have to follow the Palestinian voice. And I agree with that. And therefore I mean, again, I'm just a part of it, but the Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian people behind the One Democratic State campaign, once we get to a point where we have a critical mass of Palestinians that say, yes, this is, I mean, the ANC didn't represent 100% of South Africans. You get a critical mass of people that say, this is the just political solution we support, and then people abroad can mobilize around it. So really today, I have to say that the sticking point isn't that people don't understand the two-state solution is gone or don't accept the one-state solution. It's that the Palestinians are not yet pushing the one-state idea. And I think their fear, and I can understand it, they're isolated, they're besieged, especially Palestinians in the occupied territory or in the refugee camps. You know, they wonder if the one-state solution is doable, which I think it is because of international support. But you know, if you're just trying to survive and keep your head above water, are you going to expend the energy you need to advocate for a political solution that you think is utopian, that you don't really believe is going to happen, even though you support it? So our task now, and that's what the Palestinians in our group are doing, is to really begin to try to convince the Palestinian people all over that this is not utopian, that this is a real political struggle, this is a real political campaign. We have a good workable program, and we have massive international support today expressed by the international civil society, by the people, not yet by governments. And so we should be political actors. And hopefully that will begin. And it's not easy for Palestinians because they've been NGOified. Palestinian civil society has been depoliticized. The PA is against them. You know, they're very vulnerable to Israeli occupation, Israeli retaliation. So, you know, simply the idea of taking the one-state solution might sound like an academic or easy thing for us to do, but it's not so easy. You know, the price you pay for adopting the one state, including as Palestinian citizens of Israel.
Yeah, I think it's a good point to end on, really. I mean, I think people should realize that when people advocate one state, what we are really saying is a restoration to Palestine, to what it was, home to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and a democratic state which shouldn't really. new political community, which really based on the values and principles of democracy and human rights, which really shouldn't be controversial at all. But unfortunately, Jeff, we have come to the end of our time. I think you've crystallized a lot of ideas into your book, into one single volume. So for those who are watching, I highly recommend this book. And thank you for your time, and also thank everyone for joining us, and hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.